It turned out, he had actually torn his vocal cords from screaming non-stop. Back during the height of World War II, Russian scientists were desperate to find a way to keep their soldiers awake longer. So, they came up with an experiment. A human experiment, meant to test what happens when you push sleep deprivation to the extreme. Here's what they did: they gathered 5 prisoners of war and told them they'd be granted freedom if they agreed to take part in the study. And let me tell you, things went off the rails. The plan was to lock them in a sealed gas chamber that would constantly pump in a new kind of stimulant gas. This was a totally experimental compound, no one really knew what it would do. But they were pretty confident it wouldn't kill the subjects. It should just keep them awake. So, the men were placed inside, and the gas started flowing. This was a time before closed-circuit cameras. They didn't have live video feeds, just microphones inside the chamber, and one small 5-inch thick porthole window that let researchers peek in. At first, everything seemed okay. For the first 3 or 4 days, things were pretty normal. But around day 4, the tone shifted. The subjects' conversations turned dark. What started as casual small talk became deep, haunting reflections on traumatic events from their past. And soon, they weren't just reflecting, they began complaining about the experiment itself. In the beginning, there had been some hope, this might be their ticket out of the nightmare they were living. But now, it felt like they'd just stepped into a new one. By day 6, they'd stopped speaking to each other entirely. They grew paranoid, retreating into separate corners of the chamber. It had basic amenities, seating, food, water, books, a toilet, but it didn't matter. They each claimed their own space and avoided one another. And then something chilling began happening. They started to believe they could betray each other for a way out. One by one, they crept up to the microphones or the window, whispering accusations, real or imagined, about the others, hoping it would earn them an early release. Of course, the scientists didn't act. They just listened, and watched. On the 9th day, things took a turn for the horrific. The morning of what was probably day 10, one of the test subjects suddenly began to scream. By this point, the men weren't communicating at all. Just whispering, muttering to themselves. But then, this one subject began howling. Screaming at the top of his lungs while running back and forth across the chamber. And he didn't stop. For 3 full hours, they watched him scream until the sound abruptly cut off. But he kept running. Through the microphones, they could still hear faint noises, squeaks, like air being forced from a broken pipe. It turned out, he had physically torn his vocal cords from screaming so relentlessly. Even more disturbing, the other subjects didn't react. Not at all. As if they hadn't even noticed. Inside that tiny, echoing space, it should have been impossible to ignore. But instead, they began tearing pages out of the books, soaking them with water, and plastering them over the porthole, blocking the researcher's view. By the time the screamer went silent, by the time his throat gave out, they couldn't see inside the chamber anymore. And now, it was silent. Completely, eerily silent. For 3 days, the researchers debated what to do. No sounds. No visibility. They could only monitor the oxygen levels, and based on the data, they believed at least 4 or 5 people were still breathing. Oxygen was being consumed, so they assumed the subjects were alive. But 3 days of total silence made no sense. Eventually, they decided either the microphones were broken, or something had gone terribly wrong with the men themselves. So, they used the intercom to make contact. And they told the subjects, plain and simple, "We're coming in." They got on the intercom and said, "We're going to enter the chamber. Everyone, lie down on the floor and do not engage with us. If you comply, one of you will be granted immediate freedom." There was silence. Total silence. But then, finally, after 3 full days without a single sound, a voice came through the microphone. One of the subjects, clear as day, calmly said, "We no longer want to be freed." The researchers were stunned. That one line told them everything: they were still alive, and the microphones worked. But they didn't go in. They waited. From that moment on, the silence continued. No movement. No voices. No signs of life. And with the portholes still covered, they couldn't even see inside. And then, midnight on the 15th day, they decided it was over. The experiment was done. So, they flushed the stimulant gas from the chamber. Replaced it with fresh air. That's when the screaming started. The subjects began screaming, begging, pleading with the researchers to turn the gas back on. Please. Turn it back on. Like they were dying without it. Then the chamber door opened. And for the first time since day 10, they laid eyes on the inside. What they saw was pure horror. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive. The 5th was dead. At some point, his flesh, chunks of it from his chest and leg, had been torn off and shoved into the drain in the middle of the room. They had turned on the water in the chamber's bathroom, and it had flooded the room. About 4 inches of stagnant, filthy water covered the floor. The other 4 subjects, they were still moving. But their bodies were torn up. Chunks of their own skin and flesh were ripped off, and later analysis showed it was self-inflicted. Not chewed. Not bitten. Torn off by hand. And they weren't eating it. The food supplies in the room, untouched for days. They had completely lost their minds. They weren't eating food, they were destroying themselves. And still, they didn't want to leave the chamber. They just kept begging for the gas. Turn it back on. Eventually, soldiers were called in to extract the survivors. But the subjects fought them with unbelievable violence. One of them lunged and bit a soldier in the neck, hard enough to kill him. Another subject's spleen ruptured during the struggle, and he bled to death right there in the chamber. 2 deaths, just trying to get them out. Finally, they managed to restrain the remaining 3 survivors and took them to a medical facility. All were heavily bound, because their bodies were in a state of total collapse, but their strength was still wild and erratic. They needed immediate surgery, chunks of flesh missing, completely emaciated, and unresponsive to normal care. The most injured one was rushed into surgery first. Before they could operate, they tried giving him a sedative, just to calm him down. It did nothing. It was like he was immune to it. He kept resisting, thrashing, begging to be put back under the gas. When they finally moved to give him anesthetic, they told him, "We're putting you under now." He freaked out. He started fighting, viciously. Pleading, "No. Don't put me under. I need to stay awake. Keep me awake." The strength he showed was beyond human. He managed to rip through one of the leather restraints holding him to the table. Eventually, they had to administer an extremely high dose, just to knock him out. And the moment he lost consciousness, he died. Just like that. Then came the next worst-off subject, the one who had torn his vocal cords. He couldn't speak, but he was shaking his head violently, trying to stop the doctors. He didn't want anesthesia. Didn't want surgery. Didn't want anything. He was exhausted, his body wrecked. He fought as long as he could, and then just passed out. From sheer, total exhaustion. As soon as he fell asleep, or maybe just lost consciousness, he died too. Now there was only one test subject left. The other 2, who had survived the chamber and made it out alive, had both died the moment they fell asleep. And the scientists? They had no idea why. So instead of risking a 3rd surgery, they decided, let's just put this last guy back into the chamber. And let's turn the gas back on, because apparently, that was the only thing keeping them alive. This time, though, before placing him inside, they hooked him up to an EEG machine, to monitor his brain activity. Somehow, they hadn't done that before. So now, he's in the chamber, the EEG's connected, and the researchers are watching his brain activity on the monitor. And they start noticing something very strange. The EEG lines would randomly flatline. Just go totally flat. Then spike again. Then flatline. Again and again. And one of the scientists glances over at the subject as the lines drop, and realizes that every time the subject closes his eyes, even just for a blink, his brain activity flatlines. He wasn't just blinking. He was microsleeping, slipping out for a fraction of a second. But in those microseconds, his brain was acting like it was dying. Over and over again, brain death in miniature, just from closing his eyes. And they knew what had happened to the other two. Sleep meant death. So they start rushing, trying to get the gas turned back on, desperately working to keep this last subject alive. But they don't make it in time. Eventually, he falls asleep. At first, the EEG shows that he entered a deep sleep state. Then, flatline. His heart stops. He dies. All 5 test subjects, dead. And to this day, no one knows exactly what killed them. Was it the sleep deprivation? Was it the gas? Maybe it was both. We'll never really know. But one thing is certain, none of them survived. Now, just to be clear, this is a story. There's no evidence it's true. There's never been any record of an actual Russian sleep experiment like this. But, during the 1940s, during World War II, there were absolutely cases of unthinkable, unethical human experiments. I mean, you had Japan's Unit 731, a nightmare of its own. Don't Google it unless you've got a strong stomach. You had horrifying experiments in Nazi concentration camps. And while those weren't Russian, they were all part of that same dark era, when human experimentation was very real. So no, this specific story may not be true. But would I be shocked if something like it had happened? Honestly? No. It's absolutely possible. We're still learning so much about sleep and sleep deprivation. In fact, we don't even really know why we sleep. But we do know this: if you go too long without it, you will die. The longest anyone's gone without sleep? About 18 days. And I can speak to this personally. I was a Navy SEAL for 7 years. During training, we go through something called Hell Week. It's 5.5 days where you sleep for a total of 4 hours. Not 4 hours a night, 4 hours total. And it's broken up. 2 hours here, 2 hours there. Maybe a couple of 15-minute naps in between. After about 72 hours, you start to lose your mind. I remember clearly, I'd look at the guys around me, and their heads would turn into Rubik's cubes, big, colorful cubes flipping and spinning. Even when I got right up close, they'd still be morphing. Just Rubik's cube faces, twisting in place. That was at 72 hours. I can't even imagine what 15 days would do to your brain. So, that's it. That's my version of the Russian sleep experiment. If you want more, just Google it or check out Creepypasta. There's tons of stuff out there about it. I post daily, lots of horror and creepy stuff if that's your thing. Also, I'm on Instagram, JohnBallin416, more Navy SEAL content there if you're curious. That's it for now. Please subscribe to my channel, let me know what stories you want to hear next, and I'll do my best to bring them to life. Thanks so much for watching.